Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. At this time of great change in many areas, foreign direct investment in Europe is attracting particular attention. Transactions involving European businesses are becoming subject to more extensive and broader scrutiny than ever before. Industrial policy, for example, the promotion of national champions, has always vied with competition law as a key battleground in merger control policy in Europe. But what we're now seeing is a range of additional review criteria coming to the fore with an unprecedented level of fighting talk from the European Commission and national authorities. In this webinar, we're going to touch briefly on the nature of these changes, how they're unfolding in Europe, and their practical impact. First, the changing landscape. FDI regimes have long existed in a number of countries. Our US colleagues, for example, have advised for many years on CFIUS review. However, recent years have seen a rapid growth of FDI regimes in Europe and worldwide. 9 out of the top 10 economies in the world have introduced new or enhanced regimes in the last 2 years. A result of the existence of such regimes is that transactions are now commonly subject to FDI review in multiple jurisdictions. The introduction of new regimes and enhancement of existing ones has been fueled by advances in technology, protectionism, broader geopolitical concerns, and most recently COVID-19. The common element of these regimes tends to be a broad concept of the national interest. Existing regimes have, in many cases, been found not to be geared to significant intervention, although there have been some creative attempts to use existing structures. What has emerged is a patchwork of different national regimes, of which we'll give a few examples. Another particularly striking element is the number and importance of recent developments at EU level that are taking place outside the traditional merger control arena. In particular, as Philip will explain, a new EU framework on foreign investment review will become applicable later this year. At the heart of that regime is a cooperation mechanism that over time is likely to become an important focus of lobbying in individual transactions. In the meantime, in a communication of March this year, the European Commission exhorted member states to review acquisitions by foreign investors, even in cases involving shareholdings as low as 5%, and to use a wide range of measures to challenge such transactions where appropriate, including by means of golden shares and compulsory licensing. This effectively gives member states free rein to intervene against acquisitions by investors from outside the EU without fear of intervention by the Commission. This month, the Commission also published a white paper on levelling the playing field as regards acquisitions by companies that benefit from foreign subsidies. Not only would this target existing regimes that subsidize their domestic businesses, the timing might not be entirely coincidental in the context of Brexit. And only last week, Competition Commissioner Vestager made comments supportive of greater cross-border consolidation in key sectors in Europe. All told, we may be witnessing the greatest sea change in the review of mergers and acquisitions in Europe in 30 years, much of which will occur outside the established merger control frameworks. In terms of the practical impact, factors that Philip, Stefan and Jean-Maxime will address will include, first, the range of sectors to which these regimes can apply. Second, the broad jurisdictional reach of the FDI regimes, which can include minority stakes, asset acquisitions, and transactions not conferring ownership. And third, the breadth and variety of review criteria. As with merger control, there'll be a significant impact on transaction planning and contractual aspects, as Ulrika will briefly discuss. Therefore, as we continue to move into uncharted territory, it will be important to monitor the emerging landscape, both for hidden obstacles, but also for the opportunities that these developments might present. Finally, before handing over to Philip, this slide illustrates how the FDI landscape is evolving. And this slide gives an indication of regulatory restrictiveness by country according to the OECD. Now over to Philip.
Thank you, David, for this introduction. Having heard about the growing importance and rapid expansion of FDI regimes, the question we now face is what types of transactions will typically be subject to review. In merger control, whether or not a transaction is subject to approval requirements will usually depend on the parties' country-by-country turnover, assets, or market shares. When it comes to FDI control, however, the focus and criteria are different. The aim of most FDI regimes is to protect a country's security and public interest. In determining whether a given transaction threatens a country's security and public interest, most FDI regimes focus on three factors: the nature of the target's business, the identity of the buyer, and the transaction structure. In the past, if asked what types of industry were relevant to a country's security or to its public interest, you would probably have come up with examples similar to the ones on this slide, such as defense, nuclear power production, or satellite technology. 15 years ago, you would have been right for most jurisdictions. However, this has changed dramatically. Now, jurisdictions with fully fledged screening mechanisms want to review acquisitions of companies that are active in any of a broad range of industries. The concept of security or public interest has therefore clearly been expanded. As you can see on this slide, relevant sectors now can range from agriculture to chemicals to transport infrastructure or even chocolate and yogurt. While the last two seem particularly difficult to justify as relevant to a country's public interest, they are based on actual cases. As early as 2005, U.S. company PepsiCo considered acquiring French yogurt producer Danone, but the French government stepped in and promised to defend the company against the proposed takeover, even though the transaction at the time was not within the scope of France's FDI rules. Even now, governments are continuously widening the definition of industries considered critical to their country's security and public interest, and it does not look like this trend is going to stop. The second key factor is the identity of the buyer. Many jurisdictions differentiate between different types of buyer, not just in the course of the substantive assessment, but also in the form of different jurisdictional thresholds. Typically, jurisdictions differentiate between private investors, which are often seen as the least problematic, SOEs, and offshore entities incorporated in tax havens. The reason is simple. Where governments have identified certain companies or assets as sensitive, they want to know who will ultimately be able to influence or control them. Therefore, it is not only the direct acquirer or the acquisition vehicle that is relevant, but rather the ultimate acquirer. Buyers will have to disclose their entire group or control structures, which is something that SOEs and certain offshore companies in particular may not be happy doing. FDI rules generally do not discriminate against specific investing countries. However, in practice, acquisitions by Chinese investors will often be subject to additional scrutiny in countries with FDI regimes. The last factor is the transaction structure. In merger control, approval requirements will often only apply in cases where the buyer acquires control of the target. When it comes to FDI control, filing requirements will often also apply to minority acquisitions, and these can now be as low as 10%. Therefore, many transactions that so far have not been subject to any or only a few filing requirements, because there is no acquisition of control, now face multiple approval requirements. This will often impact timing and has to be taken into consideration when agreeing on long stop dates and the like. While most jurisdictions will look up through a transaction structure to the ultimate acquirer, there are jurisdictions such as Austria, Canada, China, or Japan that only review acquisitions if domestic entities are being acquired directly rather than indirectly. Please watch this space because some jurisdictions such as Austria are currently debating whether to change this approach. We will now walk you through some of the most important EU jurisdictions and their regimes based on landmark cases. As an introduction, I will start with the EU before handing over to my colleagues who will guide you through the intricacies of the German, French, and UK systems. In 2019, the EU adopted a new regulation which introduces a first EU-wide framework on FDI control and which will apply from October 11th this year. It contains the following 4 elements. First, it is important to understand that the new regulation does not amount to a separate screening mechanism and does not establish a one-stop shop. member states retain the competence to review foreign direct investment and can choose whether or not to adopt screening mechanisms. Second, the regulation addresses FDI screening mechanisms that are aimed at reviewing transactions on the grounds of security and public order only, which are well-known concepts under EU law. It's important to note that these concepts are broader than national security, which remains within the sole responsibility of each member state. Third, it introduces minimum requirements for screening mechanisms, including the possibility for foreign investors to seek legal recourse against screening decisions. It also provides an indicative list of factors that can be taken into consideration when analyzing transactions. It would therefore not be surprising if over time some alignment of review criteria were to emerge. Last but not least, the regulation introduces a cooperation mechanism, which is the core piece of the framework. Member states that have screening mechanisms are required to inform the other member states and the Commission of any transaction they are reviewing. The other member states, as well as the Commission, can then comment on the transaction and express their views, which the reviewing member state has to take into account. On this slide, we have outlined some of the potential effects the regulation will have on transactions. The key takeaway should be that transactions will likely be subject to additional scrutiny and that review processes may become longer. In that vein, as explained by David earlier, even though the regulation is not yet applicable, the Commission has already issued further guidance in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is particularly robust. While the regulation does not require member states to adopt FDI control mechanisms, the guidance paper urges member states to do so in order to facilitate the review of potential acquisitions of strategic assets. A number of member states, including Hungary, Poland, and Spain, have already introduced significant amendments to their existing regimes, while others, such as the Czech Republic, are working on new draft laws. I now pass over to my colleague Stefan for Germany.
Thank you, Philip. Now we would like to turn to Germany and discuss the German foreign direct investment regime. In that regard, we will take the Leifeld case as a striking example to navigate through the German system. First of all, let me introduce you to the facts of this case. Leifeld is a manufacturer for tooling machines for chipless metal forming. It employs around 200 employees, mainly in Germany, but also in the US, China, and Russia. With the revenue in 2018 in the ballpark of 43 million euros, it appears to be a mid-size German company. Yantai Taihai, a Chinese company, intended to acquire Leifeld via its fully owned French subsidiary Moinois Industries. We will come back to that important detail later when we will discuss the look-through mechanism of the German FDI regime. In the Leifeld case, FDI concerns arose at an early stage, and we are taking this case as an example to shed some light on the German FDI regime. First of all, in Germany, we have to distinguish between the sector-specific and the cross-sector approach. The sector-specific approach focuses on sensitive security areas such as defense and crypto technology. The cross-sector approach is targeted at all other industries, in particular what is considered critical infrastructure. However, it is important to note that the list of critical infrastructure is not comprehensive. So regarding the Leifeld case, let's focus on the cross-sector review for a moment. Leifeld does not operate in the area of critical infrastructure, but the regime remains applicable. The question is, however, whether we had a non-EU buyer in that case, since Leifeld was directly acquired by a French company. There has been no judgment on this question yet, but the German authorities are of the opinion that they are entitled to look through the ultimate owners, here a Chinese company. So, at the end, the review procedure for the cross-sector approach was applicable. Let's turn to our next slide to give you some background on the administrative procedures and timelines. It is the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, for our German listeners, das Bundeswirtschaftsministerium, which is the competent FDI authority in Germany. There is a notification obligation towards the German ministry applying to the sector-specific review and, as regards the cross-sector review, also for critical infrastructure. For Leifeld, what we know from public sources, there was no such notification obligation, but, as discussed, the German ministry is still entitled to review. where we do not have a notification obligation, but the case exposes a certain FDI risk, the German law provides for a certificate of non-objection, eine Unbedenklichkeitsbescheinigung, which increases the level of certainty that a deal does not face FDI concerns and is a kind of fast track because the review period for the German ministry is only 2 months. In the case of Leifeld, instead of granting a certificate of non-objection, the German ministry initiated an in-depth review. This slide shall give you an overview of the cross-sector approach and the different stages of review when the slide deck will be published on our homepage for your further review. And this slide shall give you an overview of the sector-specific approach accordingly. So let's go back to our case. Once the German ministry starts its review process, it evaluates whether a transaction is a threat to public order and security. This rather broad term allows a certain discretion to the German ministry, and there is newly introduced by the German legislator in June 2020 a set of criteria to assess a threat. The 2 most important criteria are 1, the buyer's identity, and 2, the target's industry. We have seen in the Leifeld case that a Chinese buyer could potentially attract the German ministry's attention, even if the company also has low-tech products. Assessing the risk for prohibition or remedies, there are 3 considerations that are striking. Firstly, what is the background of the buyer and the target? Do they operate in defense or critical infrastructure? Secondly, Leifeld has been to date the only case in Germany that has been prohibited. There are other cases that are publicly discussed, but are cleared at the end. And thirdly, therefore, with good and well-coordinated advice, FDI clearance can be obtained in most cases. This brings us to our last slide regarding Germany, where we want to highlight 3 changes to the German FDI regime, which have been confirmed by the German Parliament recently. Number 1, broadening the substantive review and allowing the German ministry to interfere with transactions, even if the estimated threat is lower. Number 2, additions to the set of critical infrastructure for industries helping us to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. And number 3, it is important to note a suspensory effect not to close deals before clearance, which includes possible criminal sanctions as well. To wrap it up, FDI scrutiny has become a key consideration for transactions in Germany, and the Leifeld case, as well as new legislation, demonstrate that FDI clearance could interfere with deal certainty if not well coordinated. This brings me to the end for Germany. There's so much more to say on the details, but these are the major considerations. Now I am handing over to Jean-Maxime, who will navigate us through the French FDI system, including the new COVID-19 special procedures.
Thank you, Stefan. In France, the regime was significantly reinforced over the past few years. A new COVID-19 procedure indeed, but also before that, new powers for the French Ministry of Economy, lower thresholds, and a number of sectors added to the list. But let's first take a step back to discuss briefly a case which really brought these questions in the public eye in France. It's the acquisition of Alstom's energy branch by General Electric. Alstom was the main supplier of the French nuclear industry. It was also the supplier of the nuclear propulsion system of the only French aircraft carrier, and it employed 9,000 people across the country. So when the transaction became public in April 2014, it only took 3 weeks for the government to adopt a decree extending the French FDI regime, which at that time mostly concerned defense-related sectors, to also cover a number of critical network industries, including, of course, energy. This decree, which became known as the Alstom Decree, ultimately allowed the government to impose on GE a number of conditions of a very diverse nature, including long-term supply agreements with the nuclear industry, having global headquarters in France, creating jobs in France, making significant R&D investments in France, and so on and so forth. Another case that is worth mentioning is the contemplated acquisition of Photonis by the US-based Teledyne. It is one of the latest cases, and it is one of the rare cases where the government's veto was made public. Photonis is a French supplier of photosensor technologies, including night vision tubes. It is a strategic supplier of the French army and of its special forces, and it is also involved in a highly sensitive nuclear deterrence project. So the French military intelligence community expressed strong concerns as to a possible takeover by a foreign group, and the transaction was blocked orally in last March. This decision was not formally confirmed yet, and there have been repeated nudges from the government towards French groups that would be natural investors in that field, like Safran or Thales, but they have seemed to have declined making an offer so far. So it will be interesting to see how this ends. Sectors subject to potential screening in France are of a very diverse nature. Traditional defense-related sectors, network industries, new technologies, gambling, some media, some sensitive food industries, and so on and so forth. The regime itself applies to acquisition by non-French investors, either of control over companies, of business lines, or of minority stakes above 25%, but that one is only for non-EEA investors. In such cases, notification is mandatory and a transaction cannot close before clearance. As illustrated by the two cases we discussed, foreign investments are currently a hot issue in France, involving both classic defense considerations and debates around the protection of national interests and French industrial or technological champions. In 2019, the French Ministry of Economy was granted significantly increased powers, and the applicable minority stake thresholds were lowered from 33% to 25%. And as shown in this chart, there has been not less than 3 major extensions of scope over the past few years, starting with the Alstom decree and the latest edition being biotechnologies in last April during the COVID-19 lockdown in France. Speaking of which, a specific COVID-19 procedure is being created, which is very officially aiming at preventing foreign takeovers of French-listed groups weakened by the crisis. Players the French government is looking to protect are tech companies, car manufacturers, airlines, industries that have been severely hit by the COVID-19 outbreak. This regime is to apply to non-EEA investors willing to acquire a stake of at least 10% in a listed company. It will be in force at least for the second half of 2020. In terms of procedure for standard cases is a quite classic two-phase procedure, very similar to merger control for those familiar with it. In sensitive cases, the preparation of the file and the exchanges with the Ministry's services may therefore require significant planning and time. We have seen in the Alstom case some examples of the type of commitments of very diverse nature that may be imposed by the French government. As an additional sign of the importance of these issues in France, the powers of the French Ministry of Economy, in case both of implementation without prior approval and of non-compliance with clearance conditions, were significantly reinforced last year. These powers include unwinding orders and significant penalties. The current government has recently shown that it is not afraid to impose such penalties, and it is likely that it will face even more public pressure to be very vigilant with respect to foreign investments in the years to come, as the current crisis revealed in France, like in other countries, that many industries may be considered essential to public health and security when dealing with a sudden global threat. I will now hand over to David, who will provide an overview of the existing UK regime and mention some changes that are anticipated.
Thank you, Jean-Maxime. At present, the UK has no standalone FDI regime. If a transaction falls within the scope of the applicable UK or EU merger control rules, the Secretary of State can issue a public interest intervention notice if the transaction is considered to affect any of four categories of public interest. These are national security, media plurality, financial stability, and, since the 23rd of June this year, public health. The government has intervened in about 20 transactions in this way. It has imposed conditions but has not blocked any transactions on this basis. A current example is Gardner Impcross, in which the government is now consulting on commitments to prevent a further attempt by a Chinese investor to buy a UK-based engineering company. In practice, though, the absence of a separate FDI regime has not prevented the government intervening in a number of high-profile cases where political pressure has been brought to bear on the parties, and some examples are listed here. In 2018, the government introduced lower thresholds for determining whether the UK merger control rules apply to transactions concerning the following: military or dual-use products subject to export control, computing software, or quantum technology. Last week, the government announced that it was planning to extend that list to cover artificial intelligence, cryptographic authentication technology, and advanced materials. The lower thresholds are satisfied if the target has UK turnover of only £1 million or more, or if the target has a share of supply of 25%, even if the transaction will not give rise to any increased share. These two recent changes are stopgaps, pending introduction of a new UK FDI regime. A white paper outlined a proposed new regime in 2018. It's been reported this month that the proposals in the white paper are being strengthened and that the government is prioritising the introduction of the new regime. There are suggestions that the draft bill might be published as soon as next month. As the quotations here illustrate, the UK government's messaging has nevertheless been nuanced, as it seeks to balance its commitment to open trading relationships with the need to protect key assets. In another intervention at political level, pending introduction of the new legislation, the UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee intervened directly in relation to an alleged attempted transfer of intellectual property to China by semiconductor designer Imagination Technologies, which is owned by China-backed PE firm Canyon Bridge. I will not discuss the original proposals in detail as they're likely to change. However, in broad terms, the white paper envisages a voluntary notification regime with a call-in power in relation to a wide range of sectors. The jurisdictional thresholds are broad, and the white paper provides for criminal as well as civil sanctions. However, we'll need to await the publication of the draft bill to see the government's revised proposals. I will now hand over to Ulrike to wrap up with some practical comments.
After you have heard a lot about the EU framework for FDI regimes and about details in key European countries, I will now summarize what this all means for M&A transactions. The good news is that so far, even where transactions have to be notified, only a very small number of transactions have actually been prohibited. The vast majority of deals is cleared by the authorities quickly and without in-depth review. In our experience, this was still the case during the COVID-19 pandemic so far. However, the rules are becoming stricter and more transactions will need to be notified in future. Also, the process is likely to become more political as all states want to protect their national industries. It should be noted that instead of completely prohibiting a transaction, the authorities can, as in merger control proceedings, clear it under certain conditions. Jean-Maxime already mentioned the conditions which the French authorities imposed when GE acquired Alstom. For example, a transaction might be cleared under the condition that certain control rights over key assets are retained. In other cases, authorities have restricted the access to critical information and required the implementation of measures to protect sensitive information from unauthorized access. In order to preserve sufficient domestic capacities in certain industry sectors, the authorities may require the purchaser to guarantee not to move certain production sites or research and development facilities outside the country. Buyers and sellers in M&A transactions need to be aware of the applicable FDI regimes early on. For both parties, it is key to know which regimes are applicable and which impact this may have. In an auction process, it will be a relevant criterion for the seller where the buyer and its ultimate shareholders come from to be able to assess the consequences for the FDI review process. Therefore, sellers should ask bidders to provide all relevant information already with the first bid letter. The SPA will contain a closing condition in respect of FDI clearance. Sellers will want buyers to commit to accept potential remedies that need to be implemented or observed by the buyer. The buyer, in contrast, needs to consider the costs and consequences of potential remedies which may impact the pricing of the transaction. In order to speed up the clearance process, the buyer should prepare the FDI filings in advance of the signing. The documentation to be provided to the authorities can be quite substantial and translations can become necessary. The seller can also consider engaging with the authorities before signing. This may assist in identifying where any issues are likely to arise and whether there may be sensitivities regarding specific bidders. However, the authorities will not take any formal steps that bind them in advance of a formal filing. To sum this up, FDI regimes play an increasing role in M&A transactions. However, with good preparation, the process can be managed. It was great to have you as an audience today. If you have any questions, please reach out to any of us by email or phone. You find all our contact details on the cover page of the presentation. Have a nice evening.